Olá, estamos aqui no Centro de Estudos Internacionais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas com o professor Stewart Patrick, ex-funcionário do Departamento de Estado e atual diretor do Programa sobre Instituições Internacionais e Governança Global do Council of Foreign Relations, um dos mais importantes think tanks americanos. Ele vai nos falar um pouco do seu mais recente livro, The Best Laid Plans, lançado em novembro de 2008. Welcome, Professor. Could you tell us about the book? What is it about? What's your arguments?
Yes, delighted to be here. The book is a study of one of the most pivotal decades of the 20th century, particularly for U.S. foreign policy, and it looks at basically the decade of the 1940s, when the United States, having had a tradition of isolationism and also unilateralism, suddenly embraced a global leadership role, and as part of that leadership role, decided to help to create a post-war world that was based on liberal multilateral institutions. And this was quite a departure from past American history. Since the foundation of the United States, the emphasis had been largely on independent action, retaining freedom of action and not binding the country to international treaties. And suddenly, in the space of a few years, during the Second World War, under the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, the United States played a leading role in helping to create the institutions that came to govern much of the post-war order. That's the first part of the book. It asks, why did the United States do this at this time? And the second part of the book looks at what happened when, and this is where the title Best Laid Plans comes out, what happened when suddenly the United States, having hoped for one world, a united world, came face to face with the Cold War. And it looks at how the United States adopted this concept of an open world or one world based on multilateral institutions to a Cold War in which it was actually locked in a bipolar struggle with the Soviet Union.
So, what lessons can we draw from this experience in building a post-war order?
Well, there were a number of the lessons that I talk about, and I can go into a little bit more detail about the arguments in the book. One of the lessons that can be drawn is the importance of investing in international institutions, internationally, in terms of trying to create a framework that other countries can, to some degree, find legitimate, even if the United States remains the most powerful country in the world. What's interesting during this period is that the United States adopts a posture of, to some degree, strategic restraint. Particularly, it's not all around the world, and there are big differences in how the United States operates regionally, which we can talk about. But particularly in its relationships with the major advanced democracies, the United States adopted a more egalitarian relationship with those countries than it necessarily had to, simply on the basis of power. And there was a calculation made by the United States that by giving other countries a stake in the post-war structure, that it could legitimate that structure and also ensure that it didn't have challenges inside from it. Now, I have to say that there was a certain amount of variation in the way the United States, particularly as the Cold War got underway, went about its foreign relations. It wasn't simply an egalitarian one, or one in which was really governed by strong institutions. This multilateralism was strongest in the transatlantic world, and it ended up governing, for instance, the institutions like NATO, which are based on a real formal egalitarianism. In relations with the Americas, as people in Latin America are all too, and South America are all too well aware, often the relationship was based on one that was purely a formal egalitarianism, institutions like the OAS itself, etc., but there would be a lot more interventionism. In Asia, because of the unique circumstances at the end of the Second World War, the United States relationship never really took the form of a collective security arrangement with the countries of the Asia Pacific, but more what some people have referred to as a hub and spoke arrangement, a set of bilateral relationships between the United States and countries in the region. Now, in terms of the actual order that the United States was trying to create I describe it as consisting of three main parts in terms of its multilateral vision. The first one was an order based on some aspect of collective security. And that was going to be, the hope was that that was going to be the United Nations, sort of a modified vision of collective security that would balance, on the one hand, the importance of having a universal arrangement that all countries could be a part of, but then also would vest primary responsibility in the great powers. The second element was a multilateral system of trade and payments, which would avoid the sort of economic nationalism and destructive economic policies that had helped drive the world into the Great Depression. And this wasn't simply, though, supposed to be laissez-faire economics. It wasn't simply free trade. There was a sense that world prosperity was too important to leave in invisible hands, and that we needed to have a modified form of commercial multilateralism that would allow for some degree of state intervention and for some pursuit of social welfare goals. And as we know today, we're still debating what the balance between the market on the one hand and state intervention should be, and these are major sources of controversy still. The third major source of this, the third major component of this internationalist vision I described was the support for self-determination. It was interesting that during the Second World War, the United States, although during the Cold War, obviously, it didn't always support self-determination, it did lend quite a bit of support for movements of national liberation around the world. I think, and partly it was because there was a sense that, just government comes from the will of the people, but I think there was also a strong sense that you couldn't fight a war against fascist empire and imperialism, and at the same time believe that the British Empire could continue to exist and subjugate people around the world. So that element was probably the one that became the trickiest when the Cold War breaks out, because the United States often ended up, as one knows in the Latin American context, placing the self-determination, subordinating it very strongly to the question of whether or not there were radical and, in some cases, in the eyes of Americans, communist, quote-unquote, communist elements in many third world nationalist movements. And so you ended up with a huge dilemma on the part of the United States when it appeared that, in Washington's view, had very strong leftist movements.